The axes are a very mediocre weapon class, and there are 17 of them for some reason, and honestly for most of these there's almost like no reason to use them, or just like a very small and niche use. Now thankfully as of the DLC they have gotten a lot better. Their light attack combos are a lot faster, their uncharged heavy attacks are faster, and I feel like they've separated themselves a lot more from their hammers, because before the DLC hammers just like directly outclassed them. They didn't really do that much less damage, but they got striking damage and just a lot more stance damage, because axes get the same stance damage as things like straight swords or katanas, but they're just going to typically get less range, worse movesets, and just less DPS. But now with their movesets being a lot faster, these two-handed light attack combos, for some of these options, they can just out DPS like a bandit's curve sword with a two-handed combo. Now when it comes to really small and quick types of weapons, being that you're not going to really stance break that quickly, you're kind of just better off going into power stancing combos to either maximize DPS or status effect buildup. That's why things like curve swords, spears, and straight swords are just like better off power stanced, because it just results in higher DPS due to their movesets hitting simultaneously and just better potential status effect buildup. Now unfortunately for the axes, they just get terrible power stancing combos. They have just such long animations to the point where it's just not really worth using at all. I'd much rather just have them two-handed, which is kind of how I like to see the thrusting swords as well. So if you actually did want a two-handed quicker type weapon and you didn't really care for power stancing, I think axes can be some of the best options. But yes, as always, this is just a PvE only list, and they're all going to be ranked on how useful they are. Starting off at the bottom, the Forked Tongue Hatchet, which is one of the worst weapons to come out of the DLC, and definitely the worst axe in the game too. This weapon gets the worst range and the worst damage out of all the axes. Now it does actually share the quicker type of light attack combos, which are basically identical to things like the Hand Axe and the Forked Hatchet, and it also does get passive bleed like the Forked Hatchet, but the Forked Hatchet is just going to be the same thing but better, because it just gets more damage and can be infused, because the Forked Tongue Hatchet for some reason requires smithing stones, but cannot be infused, and it gets stuck with this terrible skill. Dragon Form Flame for 14 FP does this terrible fire-based AoE that's literally identical to the Fire Breather skill that the Torches use. And the funny thing is, the Stillwire Torch Fire Breather attack literally does more damage than the Forked Hatchet. So there is practically nothing useful about this weapon at all. Like the regular Forked Hatchet just outclasses this in every single way. I don't know why the skill wasn't even the slightest bit unique. Don't know why it requires smithing stones, and I don't know why you have to farm for it either. The Forked Hatchet is basically just the direct upgrade. Number 16, the Celebrant's Cleaver, which this weapon is just directly outclassed by the Iron Cleaver. Because these two weapons also do get a unique axe moveset. They get these quick downward slams, and they also do get this heavy attack that covers a nice distance. Now the thing is, the Iron Cleaver is just going to outclass it because it has more range, does more damage in basically every single infusion, and it's going to be easier to acquire as well. All of these Celebrant weapons have the gimmick of just giving you more runes per hit, and with a Celebrant's Cleaver, it's only 10 runes per hit, which is basically useless. But the trade-off being is that it's a 5% drop rate. Like, these are some of the hardest weapons in the entire game to farm, and the benefit is just getting a worse version of another weapon, but instead you just get a bit more runes. Like, even if this thing was like 100 runes per hit, I'd still find it useless. Number 15, the Hand Axe. Now, as I mentioned about the Forked Tongue Hatchet, this actually does get the faster type of axe movesets with those light attack combos. Now, the trade-off being is that it is going to get less damage and a lot less range. They do all get the same stance damage, which is perfectly fine. And the movesets are very quick to the point where they're very easy to use, but they're not that much faster than the axes to warrant them having such little damage. Now, it's still not going to be a bad weapon by any means. Like, this weapon still gets more damage than things like the Bandit's Curse Sword, and it can swing faster. But the thing is, something like the Forked Hatchet also gets the exact same moveset, only gets a little bit less damage, but gets passive bleed. So I think that one is just going to directly outclass it. But this one does have the use of a bit more range, and it can be bought very early on in the game. A lot of these axes have to be farmed. So if you did want an axe with a faster moveset that you didn't have to bother farming for, but if you did want to put in the effort of farming, there are just going to be better options out there. Number 14, the Battle Axe, which I see very similar to the Hand Axe, in that it's just a regular infusible axe, gets average range, average damage. But the major benefit of this weapon is that you can acquire it very early on, and that you don't have to farm for it. Because unfortunately, all the best axes in the game kind of require you to just do a bunch of farming, which for some of these things aren't going to be too bad. But if that was very inconvenient to you and you didn't really care for it, and you still wanted to use an axe for whatever reason, then the Battle Axe could just be perfectly fine. But I think that's the only use that it's going to have. Number 13, the Sacrificial Axe. Now, to this point, like the next 10 options are kind of going to all be in the exact same tier because they all have very niche uses. And you can like rearrange them any which way, and I wouldn't really mind. Now, as for the Sacrificial Axe in particular, it actually does get some of the worst range out of all the axes, but actually does have a couple of things going for it. One, it gives you FP for every single kill, which is about 4 FP per kill, and actually does get the highest base damage out of all the infusible axes too. So going into these elemental builds, it actually can be the highest damaging axe in the game. Whether it be Pure Faith or Pure your intelligence, it actually can be a decent damaging option, and paired alongside the passive FP regen that you can get, it might make for a good pairing with these casting types of builds. Now the thing is, it still gets the regular axe moveset, and it gets pretty poor range, and 4 FP for every single kill is not that noticeable at all. Like, it could be good as an offhand option if you wanted to get some passive FP regen, and if you didn't really care to use weapons. But in my opinion, this thing should just be like FP per hits. Like, even if this thing was like 3 or 4 FP for every single hit, I wouldn't even consider it to be broken. It would just be a very good option and one of the better weapons in the game paired alongside these intelligence and faith types of builds. But the way it stands right now, it's just going to be a basic axe with some decent damage and like a gimmick of some more FP regen that's only going to be useful for these faith and intelligence builds. And if you wanted to go with a faith or intelligence build, there's like 100 other weapons in the game that are just going to perform better. Number 12, the ICERIND hatchet. Now this weapon does also share the exact same moveset as the hand axe and the forked hatchet, as it does do this quicker light attack combo. Now typically for those weapons, the trade-off is that it has a lot less range and a lot less damage, which is half true for the ICERIND hatchet. It does actually get a lot less damage, but the range is still actually pretty decent. Now this is a sombra based weapon that cannot be infused, and you can get it very early on, so it is going to be very easy to upgrade. It also does come with passive frost. Now unfortunately, it does get stuck with a non-unique skill in Frost Stomp, which you can acquire in the exact same location. And you could put Frost Stomp on some like other type of axe, even the hand axe that gets the exact same moveset, and it can just get more damage with both the skill and the weapon. But the main value in the ICERIND hatchet is that it's an early game weapon, very light, easy to upgrade, comes with passive frost and a decent skill. Like, it's going to be outclassed by a lot of these other smithing axes, especially once it gets like mid or later in the game. But as an early game option, it's perfectly fine. It gets a very quick moveset, it's easy to use, you get a nice AoE skill, and you just get passive frost, which is a very good status effect. But once you get later in the game, you're just better off using like another weapon, and potentially even using things like Divine Beast Frost Stomp, which are just going to be like the direct upgrade. Number 11, the SMITHSCRIPT axe. Now, every single one of these SMITHSCRIPT weapons that have these projectile throwing heavy attacks should just all be S tier, but they're just not, and it's so upsetting because From Software say that it actually has a free projectile heavy attack and feel the need to pair it alongside a bunch of different negative side effects. Now, it's not to say that the weapon is useless by any means. The weapon actually does get some pretty average damage, some average range. It does get scalings in like basically every single stat, so at these really high levels, it can actually outdamage most of the other axes. But the major selling point is going to be its heavy attack that just throws the weapon. And as I always mentioned, projectiles can just cheese the game. You don't have to engage with an enemy, and you can just keep firing off projectiles, which is going to be very good against most bosses in this game. And the fact that it's tied to a heavy attack means that there's plenty of things that can help boost the damage of this, and it's not going to consume any FP. And you have the option to either fully charge it or just use the uncharged version, which does come out pretty quick, and you can just do like a light attack damage at a distance, which is just very handy. Any single time that enemies just get further away from you, you can just damage them, which is actually not going to regenerate their stance meter, and it's just going to make the fight flow a lot nicer. Now, unfortunately, it just comes with so many downsides. One, the stance damage is just horrendous. Like, regular light attacks can just do more stance damage than the projectile heavy. It also consumes a lot of stamina, and I think the worst part is that it gets really, really bad damage fall off. If enemies are like even the slightest bit further away from you, you're just getting like less than half the amount of damage that you normally would. Even if you are hitting constant headshots, which is like another benefit of the weapon, is that it does track towards the head, the damage is still really shit at these longer distances. And in that instance, the heavy attack is just useless, and you're only going to really benefit if you're at closer ranges, and at that point, you're better off just use like a regular charged heavy attack with like a normal axe, because they're just going to get much more stance damage and not consume anywhere near as much stamina, and also just do more overall damage. So for the most part, these things are just like gimmicks with like very small niche uses. Number 10, the forked hatchet, an infusible weapon that does get passive bleed and shares the exact same moveset as the hand axe with those quicker light attack combos. Now, as I've mentioned, because it has this combo, it has to have a trade-off in damage and in range, and this thing does get some of the worst damage and the worst range in class. But the fact that it is going to be your lone passive bleed weapon out of all the axes, it's going to be pretty useful. And also, this moveset can just be faster than like curved swords and also just do more damage. So if you just two-hand this weapon, it can literally get higher DPS than a two-handed scavenger's curved sword. Now, as I've been mentioning with these quicker types of weapons, specifically if you are going to go with status effect builds, power stancing is going to be the optimal option, and power stancing axes just suck and power stancing curved swords are broken. So yeah, this weapon is nowhere near as good as that option, but if you didn't really care to power stance, this can be a decent bleed alternative. Now, the thing is, it is very reliant on bleed. If you go up against enemies that are resist or immune to bleed, it's not going to perform anywhere near as good as some of the other axes, and it is just going to have the worst range too. Now this thing also does get some split piercing damage. Now the unfortunate part is that the light attack combos don't get piercing damage. It's just only getting standard damage, which is extremely upsetting. If this thing actually did get piercing damage, I would consider this at minimum A tier, because obviously piercing damage is the best damage type in the game. And for a really quick weapon, it can make for a very nice pairing. And also, if you did want to two-hand an axe and go with a blade type of build, things like the warped axe or potentially even the ripple blade are just going to perform better. And if you wanted to power stance, then claws and curved swords are just going to be much better options. Number 9, the Jawbone Axe, which is a strength-based infusible axe, does get the regular axe moveset. Its damage can be on the higher end, but it's not going to get as much as things like the Warped Axe. And the fact that you do have to farm for it, you might question why it's even useful at all. But this thing is going to get striking damage, which this is a lone axe in the game that does get striking damage, which typically axes only get standard damage and strike is just a better option, because a lot more enemies are weaker to this type. Now typically, if you wanted a smaller type of strike weapon, you would just use a hammer instead. And hammers I typically do just prefer because they just get a lot more stance damage for very similar speeds. But axes do have a couple of benefits. One, they just do more damage, like this weapon can just straight up out damage the stone club, and they get more weapon skill options too. You can use things like spinning slash, sword dance, flaming strike, vacuum slice. Hammers don't get these options, but axes will. So if you actually wanted to use any of these weapon skills and you just wanted to really R1 spam and not really care much about charged heavy attack builds, the Jawbone Axe can be a very solid option, especially if you do end up going through a bunch of different catacombs and fight these enemies that are weaker to striking damage. This could be like a nice small secondary option to your strength type of build. Number 8, the HIGHLAND Axe. Now, this weapon is not going to be that decent as a damaging option by any means. I guess the regular axe moveset does scale a bit better off strength, but even things like the battle axe are just going to out-damage it. But it does have a couple of things going for it. One, it does get a 110 crit multiplier. So if you actually end up getting a stance break, you could just get more damage with the riposte. Now, axes don't get good stance damage at all, so it's not going to have the most amazing synergy. But the major benefit that it does have is as an offhand option, because it does boost your raw-based attacks by 10%, and it will stack with things like the raw medallion as well. So that's basically the only reason why it gets in the top 10. I would never really care to use this thing as a damaging option, as a lot of other axes are just going to straight up outclass it. But the passive effect is enough reason for this to be a B tier. Number 7, the Death Knight Twin Axes, which is another DLC type of axe in this game. And it actually is one of the very few lightning types of weapons that also get a faith scaling as well, which is very cool. It does also get a unique skill in Blink Bolt that does have this nice iframe dodging attack and like a follow-up spinning attack that can stun lock enemies pretty well, do an okay amount of stance damage, and lunge in very far. Now, unfortunately, there are going to be a bunch of different downsides for this thing, and it's going to be the reason why it's only going to get into the B tier. The major reason being is that it's a paired axe. So when you two-hand it, you do the power sensing combo, and it's not a unique power sensing combo either. So you get stuck with that terrible long axe moveset that is just very clunky, very shit to use, terrible stance damage. It's just not fun or not good at all. If this thing was just like a regular single axe, it would just be a better weapon. I wish it actually got a unique moveset instead that actually was pretty decent and not very sluggish like this one is. And another reason why I don't really care for it much is because the Death Knight's long haft axe exists. And that one also gets another version of the Blink Bolt skill, but the follow-up attack is just much more consistent, as it's a faster animation, doesn't really miss as much, and it does more damage and more stance damage too. Like the Twin Axe version can lunge in very far, and it can make it more fun to use sometimes, but it just makes it way more inconsistent, and it just overshoots the target a lot of times. But when it does land, and if you have things like the multi-hit talismans equipped, it can be a very solid option, but for the most part, I'd rather just use the Great Axe version than this one. Number 6, the MESSMER's Soldier's Axe, which is going to be the last of the DLC axes I do touch on. Now, this axe does get some average range, some average damage, but it actually does get the best axe moveset, as it does share the exact same one as the Warped Axe, which actually is going to be the fastest of the bunch. And yes, this thing is even going to be faster than things like curved swords and the hand axe. And it also just isn't going to have like a damage fall off or a range fall off either. So when it comes to like the two-handed light attack combos, this thing can just be amazing to use. But the reason why it's still going to only get into the B tier is because the Warped Axe is just better. It gets better scalings and just much better damage. Now, that's not to say that the MESSMER's Soldier's Axe is useless by any means, because it actually does get better scalings with pure elemental builds. And the fact that it has lower requirements is pretty cool too. Means that I don't really have to spec into much strength just to be able to benefit. Now, the thing is, you acquire it all the way in the DLC, where you're probably going to be at a higher level anyway. And the Warped Axe with these elemental infusions actually retain a C scaling in strength, whereas the MESSMER's Soldier's Axe only gets an E scaling. So just going into a little bit of strength and just two-handing the weapon, the Warped Axe is just going to outdamage the MESSMER's Soldier's Axe every single time when it comes to these elemental builds. So it is a very solid weapon, but in terms of its usefulness, it's going to be very niche. Number 5, the STORMHAWK axe, which is going to be a very solid early game option, and I think that's about it. Once you get towards like mid or later in the game, it is going to be outclassed by a plethora of other things. Now, it actually is one of the few weapons that you can acquire in Limgrave that does require Somber Stones, and with Somber-based weapons, they can be much easier to upgrade. And the scalings of this thing is pretty decent as well. Gets a nice strength and dexterity scaling, does scale a bit better off that strength stat, and it is to the point where it can get some of the most damage. And in fact, it actually can get the most damage early game because its skill also does buff the weapon with 120 more lightning damage, and its passive flat damage in itself is obviously really good to have early game and with weapons that are just really quick. And the skill also does double as like a Stormcaller effect. Basically, it's just like a reskinned version of that skill. Now, the downsides for this weapon is that the buff is good, but it's still not going to be that good. Things like the Dragon Scale Blade or the Dragon Halberd boost the damage by 160 more lightning damage and also add frost, whereas this one is no frost and just 120. And in terms of its skill, Thunderstorm is just going to be a worse version than Stormcaller because it just does get less damage. Like putting Stormcaller on a regular axe can just hit harder. And obviously you can infuse it, so you can put it alongside a bleed infusion and it's proc bleed as well. And you can also put Stormcaller on better weapon classes like a Great Axe or a Great Hammer, and then at that point it's like not even close. And this skill is actually very decent to use, but it's only really going to be good against enemies that can be staggered because it is a very nice stun lock. But against larger enemies, you're just going to be stuck in a long animation and you're probably just going to be trading out, and you're probably not going to be winning that trade as well. But I still consider it a very high B tier because it is a very solid and easy to weapon use early on. Number 4, the Ripple Blade. Now, this is a very unique type of axe in this game, as it does get a pure arcane scaling, and it also can be buffed. Now, the base damage of this weapon is not high, but this thing actually does get an S scaling in arcane, so at higher levels, this thing can get some really decent damage, and it's going to be to the point where it's even comparable to like the Warped Axe with a strength type of build, and it also gets the exact same moveset, which I just mentioned with the Mesmer Soldier's axe. This is the best moveset that the axes can get because these things are like literally faster than curve swords, and it's just going to do more damage too, so it can be a very solid two-handed DPS option. Now, the thing is, the Warped Axe can be infused and this one cannot be infused, so that one just does have more versatility, but the major selling point of the Ripple Blade is that you can buff it, and when paired alongside certain types of elemental greases like poison, sleep, or bleed grease, being that those status effects scale off the arcane stat and this thing gets an arcane scaling, it can proc them very quickly. So not only are you going to get really good damage, but you could also potentially get really good status effect build up too. Now, the unfortunate part is that it mainly benefits of these greases, and greases can be very annoying to farm. It's not like in the previous game that you could just like buy a whole bunch of them. And also this weapon just gets stuck with the Wild Strike skill, which is a decent skill, but honestly this R1 spamming can just be better anyway. And also the Warped Axe can just get more bleed build up with a bleed infusion and get the exact same moveset and very similar damage, and also have the ability to get infused and change up to different types of skills and use things like Cragblade and whatnot. And at that point, I think the Warped Axe is just a better option. But with an arcane scaling, you're going to have better synergy with the Dragon Communion Seal, and I think that type of build style is just going to be better overall. So if you actually wanted to use spells, I recommend just going with the Ripple Blade. Number 3, the Iron Cleaver, which is one of the better strength-based axes in this game. It actually does get the unique light attack combo of a bunch of these downward half chops. Now, these ones do seem faster than the regular light attack combo, but they're really not. Maybe like one of the attacks is like a couple frames faster, but for the most part, they're basically the exact same speeds. And it's to the point that I'd rather have the regular axe combos because having horizontal swipes are just more consistent in my opinion. But the Iron Cleaver does get really good damage, and it also does get a unique heavy attack in this cool like little charge animation. Now, it might seem a bit gimmicky sometimes because you can just close in the gap with a running attack, but this one just lets you do that in a standstill position without any single type of startup. You can just click and hold onto one button and close in the gap nicely. And obviously heavy attacks are going to do more damage and more stance damage compared to a running heavy attack, and I think it just offers such great utility. There are so many different instances to where you just like lead off a boss fight or lead off like an engagement just using the charged heavy attack, and it's just a big chunk of damage instantly. Now, there are going to be a couple of downsides. One, the motion values of the heavy attacks are just lower than regular ones, so it does this result in less damage. And it obviously is a much longer animation. Regular charged heavy attacks are much quicker, so if you actually wanted to stance break quickly, you're going to do it better with other types of things. So I recommend pairing this alongside like a higher stance damaging type of skill. So if you had these smaller openings, I'd use like the big hitting skill, and then just use the heavy attack for those situations where you wanted to close in the gap. So there are some pretty decent ways to build around the Iron Cleaver. It's not going to get the most amount of damage by any means, but it definitely does have its uses. Number 2, the ROSUS axe, which is one of the more underrated weapons in the entire game in my opinion. This is a very solid strength-based axe. It does get a little bit of an intelligence scaling, but for the most part, you're just going all into strength. It is also a unique weapon with a unique skill in ROSUS summons, which this skill just does summon a bunch of skeletons and actually do some decent damage. The skill also does scale off AR as well. And honestly, this skill is extremely efficient. It only consumes like 15 FP, does some decent damage. It stun locks very nicely, and the stagger potential is there as well. Typically, axes don't really stagger those larger types of enemies like knights or omens, but this thing can, and you can just keep spamming it over and over again. Now, I think the best part about it is that even if you do get staggered, those skeletons are guaranteed to come out. You can like click the button and it'll immediately trigger the skeleton animation. And honestly, the more that you get staggered and the quicker you get staggered, the more you can spam it. And it can result in some very decent DPS. Now, it is going to have a couple of downsides. One, it is going to be a close range type of skill with a slightly longer animation. So you might end up taking a lot of damage most times that you use it. And these skeletons don't have any tracking. If you're fighting these like smaller types of enemies that move around a whole bunch, it's very rare that you actually do hit them. But honestly, if you haven't already used the ROSUS axe, I recommend that you do. It's very fun. And at number 1, the Warped Axe, which is like the lone S tier axe in this game in my opinion, and it kind of just makes almost every single infusible axe just useless too, because this thing just gets the most damage and it gets the fastest moveset as well. Like, I don't know how this thing managed to get a combination of both, but yeah, this unique light attack combo that it does get is literally just faster than all the other ones, and this thing gets an S scaling in strength, so it just hits the hardest, and it also does get bonus status effect build up. Like, this thing can get like greatsword types of bleed with a bleed infusion, and it can also just retain an A scaling in strength. So not only can you get some really good DPS, but you can proc bleed faster than like a lot of different types of weapons in this game. So any single time you go up against enemies weaker to bleed, go with a bleed infusion. And if not, just stick with a regular strength infusion and you're just going to be getting insane damage. Just two-hand this bad boy, R1 spam, put it alongside Crag Blade. Or if you wanted to use skills, you could do that too. The only downside is that it does have a higher strength. So if you actually wanted to pair it alongside elemental builds, you are going to have to spec into a decent amount of strength, but it actually isn't going to be wasted stats because even with these elemental builds, it still retains a decent strength scaling. So if you actually wanted to have like a strength intelligence or a strength faith type of build, this one could be pretty decent too. It does require a little bit of farming, but once you do finish the farm, you probably have acquired the best axe in the entire game. Anyway, that's now done. It feels like the more ranking videos we actually make, the harder they actually are to make as well. There are just a bunch of mediocre axes in this game, and trying to just rank mid weapons are just very hard because they all have such niche uses. So do just let me know what your opinions are and what your findings are down in the comments below. And as for the next video, it is going to be the great axes. We're going to rank those from worst to best, and then we'll end up moving along to the hammers and the great hammers and stuff like that. So if that does interest you, please do like and subscribe, and also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there basically every day doing a bunch of different challenge runs, and that's where I end up testing out all of these different types of weapons too. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.